Welcome to Season 5 of the Becoming Trauma-Informed podcast. I'm Dr. Lee, your host for the past 4 seasons, and I am delighted to announce the addition of a very special co-host, my husband and business partner, TLC.
To become trauma-informed is to understand how trauma occurs, why it happens, and how to respond in a way that leads to repair and reconnection instead of further pain and harm. One of the biggest causes and effects of trauma is history literally repeating itself. Whether it's toxic patterns passed from parent to child, repetitive wars, political discord, or simply the habits we keep participating in despite our best efforts, patterns are evident everywhere we look. One thing is clear. If our past painful experiences aren't discussed and processed, the harm doesn't just continue to affect us. It seeps into our relationships, our work, and perpetuates damage into our future.
On this season of the podcast, TLC and I will be discussing some of the most notable historical events in humanity and exploring what the past can teach us about the present, plus the potential impact on our future. We'll also be deep diving into popular trends and current events, exploring them from an intersectional and nuanced perspective. We'll focus less on finding the right answer and more on sparking curiosity and conversation. We're not going to sugarcoat it. The topics we broach will be activating, and the discussion will likely get passionate. We're leaving no stone unturned and publicly exploring the questions that most people dare not to even speak aloud. So if you're looking to learn more about trauma, to understand your own experiences deeper, or to dive into some slightly taboo conversations, we're excited you're here.
Let's get into it.
Hey y'all, welcome to this week's episode, and we're going to be talking about a history of trauma. You excited?
Yes. Oh yeah, welcome.
This is going to be such a rich episode, and I'm really excited about it. We're going to be talking through a lot of stuff, honestly, looking at a very brief and broad overview of how historians have written about trauma, how science has written about trauma. And this conversation came about in an interesting way. So it's actually the conversation that also led to us being co-hosts on the podcast together. So I had made a TikTok and it went viral, which was awesome. And it was really surprising because what I had done is I had connected 3 historical events and talked about how I could see how they impacted how trauma shows up in our society today. And we had so many people say, you should make a book about this. You should, we want more, please teach us more. And I was so surprised by it. And I was telling TLC about it. And I was like, I really wonder, this is sparking my curiosity. And you're a historian, you know how to research and this is your zone of genius. Where did we talk? What's the first time that we ever saw someone talk about trauma in history? What has the writing been about in trauma? When did we really start recognizing trauma as something that was important enough for us to be talking about and writing about and seeing it as a phenomenon? And so you went in a total rabbit hole deep dive and put together a really great episode, which I'm excited to get to kind of ask you questions around and let people hear, honestly, let people just hear how brilliant you are. But before we get into that, you and I had talked about the fact that we wanted to just do a basic overview of what we mean when we say trauma, and also the different types of trauma that exist, because we know that people have been listening to the podcast. Some people have been listening to this podcast for, since season 1, 115 episodes, and they're well versed in when we say trauma, what we mean. And other people, this might be the very first time you found us. And if so, welcome. We're so excited you're here. And we wanted to make sure we're all on the same page from a definition standpoint. That's really important for us in our spaces. So when we are going to be talking about trauma today, a lot of people define trauma as, and actually we're going to talk about the history of coming up with the definition of trauma at the end of the episode, but a lot of people use the American Psychological Association definition of trauma, which talks about a serious or significant event that leads to negative consequences. And the reason I don't love that definition is because I think it's a little too narrow. It lacks context. So when you think about serious and significant, right? One of the ways that we can categorize trauma is looking at, is it serious and significant enough that if anyone went through it, they would have a negative event? Like almost any person who went through that would be like, that was really serious and really significant, and it caused harm in at least one area: physical, mental, spiritual, sexual, financial, emotional, one of those areas, relational. And, versus, no, it was serious and significant to me and may not have been serious or significant to someone else. And the reason it's serious and significant to me is because of other things that I've had happen in my past, or because of my personality, or because of underlying factors that were there at the time. So, something that's serious and significant to a 2-year-old is not the same thing as, or may not be as serious or significant to someone who's 52. And so when we think about trauma, instead of looking at it as the event itself, what has really shifted and I think opened up the ability to recover and heal on a societal level and on an individual level is looking at trauma as an aftermath, looking at trauma as it's not the event, it's what transpired or what changed after that. And so if we think about trauma and that negative effect it has, did it cause constriction, meaning that it caused me to isolate? It caused me to cut off pieces or parts of myself, or cut off relationships, or cut off my access to the world? Did it cause restriction? Did I learn that I needed to be less, or that I needed to show up in a very specific way and restrict how I thought or moved or believed? Did I need to restrict who I was in relationship with, or how I was in relationship with them? Or did I need to restrict how I moved in the world? And then the third piece of this is disconnection. So disconnection is a hallmark sign that trauma has happened. And this is where there's a rupture, and you either disconnect from a possibility, you disconnect from an opportunity, you disconnect from another person. Sometimes what the disconnection that happens is between our body and our brain. So sometimes our brain goes, hey, that was so painful. Your body's going to remember that this happened, and your brain isn't. And so we see this a lot in people who have PTSD. We'll see them have something called flashbacks, where, or emotional flashbacks, where they will have recurrence of memories that maybe they had repressed for a really long time, and they start getting these intrusive images, or they have sensations in their body that remind them of when they were in that traumatic experience, but they can't remember what traumatic experience they were in. And so, we'll get a lot deeper into those types of things in other episodes, and we have in previous episodes. And for today, I wanted to just speak to that because that's informing the conversation we're about to have. When we think about putting this new and rapidly evolving and deepening depth of understanding that's happening in the field of trauma and in the field of neuroscience and nervous system regulation and recovery and resilience, all these things, it's so easy to look back at the past and be like, oh my gosh, how didn't they see this? And so as you're listening to what TLC is going to share, I think that that's just such an important place to start from. Is it's really easy in the current moment to look back and go, oh, well, this is so clear what was happening. And it can be really tempting to judge the past based on the present knowledge. And so we want to just invite you to get curious about that. If you hear some of the things we talk about and you're like, oh my gosh, these people were horrible, or how could they have done this, or how did we not know this? Well, we didn't know what we didn't know. And so on that note, TLC, I think one of the other things that would be, and if you're open to it, that would be really, I have never liked learning history until I started learning history in the way that I now learn it. Meaning, I couldn't connect with history until recently because I didn't understand how history was created or written, and I didn't understand. I think a lot of times I just thought history meant the facts. I didn't understand how much subjectivity and how much personal perspective goes into history. And so can you just like explain what history is usually about and like what it's supposed to be about and then like how that subjectivity gets placed on top of it?
Oh yeah. And I think you really hit the nail on the head there. That is one of those things. People see history, and I don't think sometimes they see it in the same way that they may see science or, medicine or something like that, where it is progressing as it goes. Nowadays you're right. Historians are able to really look at events and really look at them with more depth. But just like how in science now, if you looked at somebody and said, well, how didn't they understand how chemistry of plastics worked? Well, it seems pretty straightforward. Well, it seems straightforward with the knowledge that we have now.
Yeah.
So when people would do histories, especially the early histories, were very much more just like, this thing happened, this place, this time, this is what was going on. And that's also in part because only some history ends up surviving. The stuff that people were like, we cannot forget this. So something's just being lost. There's some things we even know exist or existed at one point. Actually, one of the examples I have is, Polybius's histories, and they know that there's multiple other books that he wrote. People knew of them. They would even kind of reference them, but the actual individual books are all gone at this point. So not only has it been moving forward and there's being more depth to understanding, there's more of that human type element. I think sometimes when people think history, they may think of the really old style of history of 50,000 troops on this side, 50,000 troops on this side, this date, this is what the result of it was. And I can completely understand where that gets boring, because even with my background, in ancient history, there were some times where it was like, okay, so what was that battle again? Why am I learning about, this specific thing? And yeah, it has been something, that's been really evolving. And I think trauma itself makes it difficult in some ways, because the individualized part of it, it makes it hard to generalize it across a group of people.
Yeah.
And I think really when you look at it, people have talked about traumatic events and the effects of those events on individual people literally since some of the earliest written records.
I mean, I'm just thinking about like the most read book in the entire world, whether you believe it's real or not, like the Bible. If you go in, like, how much trauma is in that? I'm a lot of the works that I remember reading with you when I was in like my ancient Greek and Roman, those courses I had to take, and I was like, let me take them with my husband, because at least then I have a study buddy. I remember a lot of those books, you'd be reading them and like you're reading what's happening to the people in that, and you're like, this is incredibly traumatic.
Oh yeah. And it's weird, because in some cases people would even recognize it in some ways, but then still seemingly not be able to quite put the pieces of it together.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, sometimes the absence of things, causing issues. And it's like people may have in some level kind of understood that, but the effects of it being afterwards, there was a lot of times of like, well, why did he do that? Why wouldn't
or why didn't he? We were talking about this before we started around, absence trauma versus intrusive trauma. And intrusive trauma is when somebody violates a need or a boundary. Absence trauma is where somebody doesn't meet a need, like through neglect. And so much of when you're looking at history and you're reading the facts, you're like, well, why wouldn't they have done this? Like, why did they not move at that moment? Why did they not fight back? Why? That's one that you see through a lot of history and a lot of trauma. Why didn't they stand up for themselves? If we're looking at this not through a trauma-informed lens, if we're looking at this going like judging, instead of being curious and going, I wonder what had happened before that. And I think that this is what actually sparked my interest in the history part, is starting to go, well, what happened just before that person made that decision? Or what happened in their parents' lives? Like we've talked about ancestral and generational trauma. What got passed down through this person's DNA? Literally, like trauma passed down, learning that you need to constrict or restrict or disconnect from this specific group of people, or not show up in this type of place. Like, how did that impact their decisions in that moment that then led to this, big war or this casualty or whatever. And so,
Oh yeah.
you
And
know,
I think too, like I was saying, in terms
yeah,
of history getting better, where it has gotten more of that, you see, especially earlier times where like this general would have fought a whole bunch of battles beforehand, lost a lot of troops, but in traditional history, well, he won the battle,
mhm,
and that was okay, and that was okay. And after an entire campaign of like maybe even a decade
yeah,
of seeing his soldiers die, of seeing even when he won, and then okay, all this time later, all of a sudden he decided, maybe I'm not gonna advance here. Maybe I'm gonna try and find some
yeah,
other way. And people go, well, that was a failure on his part because he could have won. See, if he would have just
yeah,
pushed here, this was the lesson we should take from this. This is the what we should understand. In this case, you need to push forward, but without recognizing, like, okay, but what happened to this person? What did this person see in the last 10, 20 years of a campaign?
yeah,
And seeing a lot of the people that he knew die, a lot of the generals and people near him, physically speaking,
yeah,
even maybe that may have made him a little bit more, cautious. Maybe there was other things going on within him. It wasn't just a completely tactical decision to
yeah,
not do it. And I do feel like history now seems to be kind of more understanding. Again, within the past 100 years, you really especially start seeing historians start looking at that and go, okay, well, this is probably why he
yeah.
didn't do that. Starting to add more of that why context rather than just the who, what, where, and when.
I'm glad you're speaking about this too. I love how we have this whole plan and then we just immediately go somewhere else. We'll still do the plan. And I think that this is really important because you are speaking to something that I think a lot of people don't know. And I didn't know this until recently. So if you're like, oh my gosh, I never really thought about this, cool, you're in good company. Like there's that saying, history is written by the victors, right? To the victor goes the spoils. And so they're understanding that whoever is writing the history, the facts that they are putting down, if there is any subjectivity whatsoever in those facts, that is influenced by what this person has personally gone through, including their past painful experiences. And so it is why you can read two books on the exact same experience. It's why, if you look at society today, you can have two people learn a fact, the same fact, and go, okay, well, this fact makes me support this person, this political candidate, and the other person goes, well, this fact makes me support this political candidate, and it's because of, and it's that personal experience that gets brought into it. It's that ancestral and generational, and it's not just trauma, it's also positive experiences too. But sometimes when I hear somebody or I read a historical book and the perspective they're coming from, I'm like I want to internally combust because I'm like, I don't even understand how you could write this from this perspective. I have to stop myself and go, okay, well, this person's probably led or lived a very different life and had a very different perspective on life and had different traumas than you have. So you got to look at it through that.
Yeah, it is. And they were brought up in a place where certain things that to us even too would have been seen as traumatic, but that would have been in a lot of ways unseen as the norm. But that still doesn't mean that it doesn't affect them in some ways. I think sometimes there's always that you want to see it as either a positive or a negative. Sometimes it just is. It might just be a change to that person and how they're viewing the world. Not necessarily positive or negative, but that's going to influence how you describe things.
Yeah.
How your viewpoint on certain things, what's important even. Certain times there's been historians that have just bemoaned like not having information about daily life or what was the life of women like?
Yeah.
What was the life of all these different segments of society? And it's like, well, why wouldn't they record that? And in a lot of ways, yeah, that wasn't their experience. That wasn't what they knew or understood. And so when they would really sit down to write something like, okay, I'm going to write down the important things, what would be important to them? Well, they were traditionally like men who lived in, in certain segments of society and stuff like that. No, they didn't talk about the diet of slaves.
Right.
Because it was like, well, who cares?
Right. Like that doesn't impact my life at all. And I mean, it does, but in my perspective, that doesn't impact my life. That doesn't seem important. And, it's we're going to talk about this in a minute. The one of the things that it's so funny. I feel like TikTok's always teaching me lessons that I don't realize I'm going to be using somewhere until like right as like we're in a conversation like this. But there's been a recent TikTok where we were talking about what being a multiracial or biracial person looks like in the US and around parenting and interracial love and all this. And there were a lot of opinions on this TikTok. And what I found so fascinating is a lot of the opinions on there, I was like, how on earth could somebody have this opinion? And then I had to stop myself and take that trauma-informed lens and go, hold on, Lee, what is their history? How did they learn history? And how has history brought both of us or all of us to this moment to have this conversation and have such vastly different perspective? Honestly, that is such a big reason that we wanted to do this podcast too, is because in today's society, a lot of times we can't talk about things, we can't have discourse or like healthy discussion. I had to literally turn the comments off on this TikTok, not because I couldn't handle the things that were being said to me, but because I was like, there are other people who don't have experience and regulation around watching people like destroy each other in a comment section, and particularly around race. I'm not going to like be a steward of that conversation. I'm not going to create a space where people can cause perpetual harm. And we are really struggling to have conversation today because I think that we don't understand the history that we're about to go into. Mm-hmm. And we don't understand how our personal histories impact our perspectives and how individualized that is. Like nobody else is going to have the same perspective you do ever on all things.
Yeah. It's that individualized approach, that really adds so much.
Yeah.
But also I feel like too, that is part of what makes it so hard to have really, historically speaking, like have really nailed that down, because it is so individualized. It's like you see certain events take place and people go, oh, that makes sense that caused them to maybe go in depression or something like that. Yeah. Okay. The loss of a spouse. Okay. You saw your best friend killed in front of you. Okay. Those kind of major episodes seem to make sense, even when they ended up affecting an individual.
Yeah.
It was like people could much more easily put themselves in their shoes.
Yeah.
But I think, that's partly why I think it took so long for people to really start doing it, because certain things that you couldn't easily put yourself in somebody else's shoes and go, oh yeah, that makes sense why I would do that. People would generally just discount that because it doesn't seem logical or rational to them. It was like, well, why does that affect you? Well, again, because of everything else, because it is to that individual.
Yeah. And what a perfect rationale for why being trauma informed and understanding what trauma is, how it occurs, and how it impacts how we see the world, like why that is so important, because it literally changes history. And so here's my first question for you. When you went back and really did this research, like what was the first historical account that you found or that others have found describing like this more modern idea of trauma, mm-hmm. this idea of there being constriction, restriction, disconnection, either physically or psychologically in someone?
Yeah, really the earliest ones kind of related to that almost exclusively tend to be related to big, massive events.
Okay.
Specifically warfare being the main one, because again, it is generalizable across humanity. People can understand people getting killed, warfare, stuff like that. That's going to be, a traumatic situation. So even some of the earliest literature that's known to exist, some of the earliest histories would in a lot of ways touch on traumatic events. Now, in some ways it was more from this is a kind of a more, I think, to say this is a Marvel happening, mm-hmm. Like almost as like, we recognize that we don't quite understand what's going on, but like obviously something is, one of which being in Herodotus's book, Histories, he talks of an Athenian Aeschylus? Yeah.
Appeasalus.
Yeah.
We're trying to read this off that, yeah, Appeasalus. Yeah. Yeah. So this is in Athens.
Mhm.
Okay.
And while he was fighting, he makes mention that he was deprived the sight of his eyes, neither having received a blow in any part of his body, nor having been hit with a missile, and for the rest of his life, from this time, he continued to be blind. And so he kind of goes on to more describe the situation when they asked him, like, what happened? What was the cause of this? He said he was standing in a row of other soldiers, and there was a tall man, full armor in front of him, um, big guy with a beard, and he turned and he was standing there and he realized there was no way he could stop him from killing him. Like he had the high ground on him. Thought he was going to die. Instead, he turned and killed the soldier next to him and kept moving. And he ended up being fine. He thought physically, he thought he was going to die. Instead, kills the guy next to him, keeps moving. He ends up surviving. And so he really kind of talked about it as like such a weird thing. He went blind, even though he didn't actually get hit by this guy. But when they asked him, he could give like exactness about what the guy looked like. He had this big beard, this glowing, gleaming shield that he stood in front of him. Like he remembers that last moment he had right before the event. And then after that, he had,
no recollection.
No sight. He completely lost sight.
So that's really fascinating because we see that, like, I love that this is the first thing that you found, and because I can't tell you how many people have what we refer to as conversion disorder, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but like conversion disorder in today's society is where you have physical symptoms after a event that causes trauma that you can't connect to any traditional medical issue. And so I will see this with people who they'll have seizures, and then we'll see seizure activity in their brain, but there's no known cause for the seizures. I'll see this with people who develop ulcers or they develop stomach cancer. They'll have like severe nausea and vomiting. Like there's all of these, a lot of times it's interesting. It has to do with the heart and the gut. You'll have people who will have literal heart attacks. It's called broken heart syndrome from having such a significant trauma happen to them. And it's not even a physical trauma, it's an emotional trauma. It's not something that actively damaged their heart, and yet it's profoundly impacting that part of their body. And so I love that this is the first thing that you found, because I love that there's evidence for like the last that was way back BC, right? That was in the 2000, 2500 BC. Yeah. So that might not be right, but that's what I've got in front of me. Google is so great for a reason. We can look at it after to see if it's right. But the cool part about this is that conversion disorder there's evidence of this from like the first writings that we have.
Yeah.
That something that is so psychologically traumatic. And by the way, that's not even primary trauma. That's not even trauma that's happening to him. That's him. That's what we refer to as secondary or vicarious trauma. That's trauma happening to someone else in front of him and him actually surviving, which if you talk about survivor guilt, you look at PTSD after surviving something that most other people around you did not. That is a really common thing in today's society too.
Well, that, as you're saying that reminds me too, one of the other earliest examples is also very similar to that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which again, one of the, if not the earliest work of literature, definitely one of the earliest works of literature, in that the main character Gilgamesh witnessed the death of his closest friend, and afterwards he would he was tormented by the trauma. He had recurring and intrusive recollections. He couldn't sleep, had these like waking nightmares, and it was like a big part in the story of like after witnessing his best friend's death, him surviving, and how it then like would affect him. And it's like even in some of the earliest works of literature now wasn't the main focus, but it was really talked about.
Yeah, and that's actually to share a personal piece here. I remember hearing stories that my parents would tell me of, like, when you were 4, 5, 6 years old, you had these horrific night terrors, and you would basically like have your eyes open, look awake, and be screaming at the top of your lungs, but you were fast asleep. And the one thing that would get that to stop was for us to take the video camera out, because your doctor was trying to get us to get it on tape so he could see it, because he's like, I've never seen this before. And every time we bring the video camera out, you'd wake up. And it was the oddest thing. And, fast forward 25, 30 years later, we find out that there's childhood abuse, molestation that's been occurring at a caregiver's house outside of my family's home that's my parents are unaware of, or weren't aware of at the time. And I'm like, and it was just an interesting connection that I ended up making in therapy, going like, oh, those night terrors were happening because like my body knew something was wrong, and my little like 5-year-old brain couldn't make sense of it, because this person who loved me was also hurting me, but framing it as love. And so, when we talk about trauma today, one of the biggest hallmarks of PTSD is nightmares, intrusive thoughts, intrusive memories or visualizations of the thing that happened. And so if that's something that's happening, like that's usually a pretty significant sign. And by the way, if this is you and you're listening and you're like, oh my gosh, I have that may mean that something happened. It may mean that it didn't. There might be something else going on. And that's one of the things that when I work with clients and I ask them, I'm like, hey, like, how are you sleeping? And they're like, oh, I have horrific dreams. And it's the same dream over and over, or yeah, no, I'll have these intrusive visions while I'm awake. Okay. Like we've probably got some PTSD happening.
Yeah. Well, and you got to think too, especially before a time where people understood how the brain functioned,
right?
How any of this happened, seeing another soldier, something that happening to somebody,
yeah,
would have been like, whoa, something's going on. Like something is obviously wrong. Like Hippocrates that was one of the things that he talked about, even in some of his early works, is soldiers experiencing essentially that. Like these soldiers would be sleeping, they would be having these essentially, like what seems, when I was reading it, kind of seems like night terrors.
Yeah.
They were having these dreams. It was causing, they were having a very difficult time. They were screaming, there was yelling. And it was enough. You got to think there were only very few doctors or anybody that would have been considered a doctor, but for like the other soldiers to bring the soldier and be like, hey, something's wrong here. We got to like figure this out. And to the point where he would like mention it is like, oh, like this does seem like this is something wrong. This is something that's mentionable, not just like this is a normal occurrence,
Well, and if that name sounds familiar to you, Hippocrates, if you've ever heard the Hippocratic Oath, like Hippocrates is one of the founding fathers of what we now know as modern medicine. He's the one who said, do no harm, which is actually a really fascinating thing that is for another episode, talking about how the medical community says do no harm. And yet, if we really get into intrusive trauma versus neglectful trauma, a lot of what happens in traditional medical institutions these days is if we can't explain something, and we're like, well, we don't know, like, good luck. And that can feel really neglectful to patients who are like, hey, versus like, you know what? Yes, this thing that's happening to you is valid and we don't understand it, versus, well, I hear you say that you're having these symptoms, and also like, there's nothing that we know scientifically that could be causing that. So yeah, I don't know, go lose weight, go try to exercise more, like try to drink some more water, go do those things. So, I think it's a really fascinating piece of information that Hippocrates is the one saying like, hey, I'm seeing soldiers. And again, a lot of these earlier works are around war, right? Yeah. They're around battles. I don't know if I want to say institutional, but like this militarized violence.
Oh yeah. Yeah. This direct death that would have been, again, seen by any quote normal or rational person as being traumatic.
That's actually a great point. So, and let me make sure I'm catching your point. The point you're making is that a lot of the writing, the historical documentation around trauma is happening in the military because of that traditional way that we looked at trauma, which is it's serious and significant.
Yeah.
To almost anybody.
Because anybody, if even nowadays, if all of a sudden you were popped down into, into a fierce battle in Ukraine,
Yeah.
it would be terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to have seen video of it. You don't have to have actually been there to recognize that would be horrible.
Right.
Like, that would be terrifying. And in the same way, even at that time, you may not have fought in this epic battle with hundreds of thousands, in some cases, of deaths occurring and bodies being strewn all over the battlefield to go, I don't want to be there.
Yeah.
That would be scary. That would be horrible to see.
Yeah.
That would be very bad. Like, I don't want to be there. In fact, I'll send other people, or I will, like, that's why you don't normally see a lot of, like, all the politicians who are voting for it also going like, okay, now I want to go and be on the front lines at the same time or immediately afterwards. You're like, it needs to happen, but also there seems to almost be that subconscious recognition, like, I know it needs to happen, but I don't really want to be there. I don't really want to see that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that this is so timely with just in our world today, where there's a lot of war happening and we know about it more. We like, there's a lot of militarized and extreme radical violence happening in the world today for a vast majority of reasons. And most of the time, right, here's what's so fascinating is when you look at the quote unquote sides in those, and we go back to this historical perspective, both of those sides have their peoples have history, right? And so I don't even want to like, I want to toe dip into this for a second and then like promptly come right back out, because I want to make sure that we're staying on it with the essence of this episode. And this is something I see a lot in the Israel versus Palestine conflict right now, is you will hear people talking about the horrors that are happening. And depending on what side people are on or the historical context that they are using to interpret what is happening, you will get very different opinions on what needs to be happening in that space. And the interesting thing about it is that if you put the trauma lens on top of this and you go, you know what, let me take out the historical context of the people on this side versus the people on this side, or the people caught in between, or all of that, and you look at it, the number one thing that I think everyone can agree on is that harm is being caused, is that trauma is being perpetuated. And it's that a lot of the people who end up in these, who are soldiers or who end up as either primary or secondary victims of trauma in these spaces, like, it's serious and it's significant and it has long lasting impact.
Well, I think too, in part with the advent with modern society, where you have so much wall-to-wall news coverage, you have, the more focus you have on some of these things, in some ways, the more that trauma can propagate out.
Yeah.
Because again, if you even look within the last 100 years, within a time period where there are humans still living, and you look across the world, you're like, okay, but this thing happened, but it didn't have the eyes on it. It didn't have the focus on it. And while it doesn't make the people who are involved in it make it any less worse.
Yeah.
But to the collective, mind, if you will,
yeah,
it doesn't seem like as big of a deal. It's like everybody remembers Hitler and the Holocaust. A lot less people remember King Leopold of Belgium and the Congo, where millions of people were killed. And I mean, I'm again not going to go into it.
Yeah.
But in ways that were horrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about in terms of trauma, intentional infliction of trauma to the victims in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
Like, and even within other parts of the world now, where you have, like, within Africa, you have within lots of different places.
Yeah, China, North Korea.
Yeah. Terrible things that will be happening to the people that are involved there. But when you don't have as many eyes and it doesn't spread out as much, it's always been interesting to me, because on a lot of times it almost seems to get, like, yes, if you ask people, okay, 2 million people, or in some cases, depending on the numbers, up to almost 6, 7, 8 million people killed in the Congo.
Yeah.
People would go, wow, that's horrible. That's terrible. But in terms of, like, when you mention, something that there was lots of cameras, lots of, imagery pointed out, people will go, oh yeah,
That was
Auschwitz,
horrific.
Birkenau. You remember the names of places, you remember the names of people. That personalization almost really kind of makes it stick to more seemingly in people's mind, where
Yeah.
it's like, make no mistake, what's happening in Israel and Gaza is horrible. But if you're looking just in terms of a scaling model,
Yeah.
it's fascinating to me that, like, even in the Ukraine, which I feel like in some cases people have forgotten, you have just terms of battlefield casualties, best figures, you're looking at almost 500,000 people or thereabouts casualties, at least 100 to 150,000 dead, kind of debating on how close we are. Same thing on the Ukrainian side.
Yeah.
You're talking of like 300,000 people potentially dead. And if you're just looking straight scale, it's like it doesn't scale that same way, because
well, and it speaks to, and we're actually going to talk about an episode on, or we're going to have an episode on propaganda, and not speaking to the fact to say that, like, I just want to be so clear here, like, it all matters, right? Every single person who is harmed, and every instance of trauma matters. And the way in which history gets written, back in the times we're talking about right now, where we say the way that history gets written today, it's the way that history gets communicated, because it can be communicated through social media, it can be communicated through video or through news outlets, it can be communicated through written, or we have so many different ways and channels of
and even
communication.
who can write about it.
Right.
Nowadays, you can live in the United States, you can live in Europe, and you can be, in some ways, almost a correspondent covering a conflict that you're not even there for.
Right.
Whereas in, Roman times, you had to be there or be with the army, seeing the actual events. There wasn't that newspaper article. Even once you start getting into the 1800s, you start really having more of that rise of the news, being able to really send that out. And then you have people who can write, even later on, even much later on, looking at all the newspaper sources, people that had written down primary, sources of talking to a person who was there at the battle.
Yeah. And I think that that's really a big part. And this is something you've taught me is, primary sources really matter like when you're looking at the history of something, going to primary sources, people who were actually there and experienced it, or videos of the actual, and not just a snippet or a clip, but the full context. And I want to bring this back to, there were a couple other examples that I remember you saying of, looking in the 17 and 1800s around soldiers, because that 1860s to beginning of the 1900s was where we really started shifting away from just seeing trauma in these war or battle experiences, and moving to, like, wait a second, we see this in other places too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because really before that, you saw, 1600s, you had people talking about soldiers' nostalgia. Like, the idea was maybe that they were, in part, like, missing home. They were missing the quiet of home as maybe kind of being the cause.
You're like, or I miss not being shot at every day, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and even, Civil War, you start, soldier's heart. There was, this idea that, homesickness, and that unfortunately led in a lot of ways to it being seen as, well, okay, why is it some people and not other people? You have a unit of 50 men, of those, maybe say 10 experience these effects, but the other 40 don't. Okay, why? What is the difference between these 10 people?
But they weren't being curious about it, they were judging.
Exactly. Oh, it was straight judgment. It was weakness of character. It was immorality. Really, all the way up until World War I, you started looking at ones like moral strength. If you ever look at some of the things when you would get drafted, you go to the draft board, and they would ask you to fill out all these different things. Now, some people will look at it and go, okay, well, why were they ever interested in this or that? Why did they care if you were gay or straight? Why did they care? Was it the early assumption was, oh, well, it must have made a difference to their battle ability, how good of a warrior they're going to be. But in a lot of ways, what they were trying to weed out was people who they saw as having a
morally weak character. And those were the people who were going to have essentially PTSD. They were going to maybe couldn't handle it anymore. Quote, they would break and they would run from battle.
Yeah.
And if you had some of your soldiers retreating during battle, a lot of times you would see this. You'd see some people running and everybody else looking, well, they must know something I don't. They would also turn and run.
Yeah.
Everybody starts fleeing. Then you start having your soldiers run. You may lose a battle.
Yeah.
Because there was something that they got spooked on or they got scared about.
So there's two things that come up in my brain when you say this. And the first one is that we've talked in a lot of spaces. We talk about this in Trauma Club. We talk about this in our 9-month certificate program about trauma responses and threat responses. And threat responses are basically our innate survival system. It is the cascade of things that we will try in order to survive when we perceive a threat. And other mammals do this too, but the very first thing for humans is something called flock. And flocking is where when you perceive a threat, you look around to everybody else and go like, hey, are you scared by this too? And so I can understand now from a administrative or like leadership perspective, and these terms that we're using today, like fight and flight was the only way we talked about our threat and trauma responses up until, I want to say, 10, 15 years ago. Flock is a relatively new term for people. But flocking, if I'm a leader and I'm going, I need all 50 soldiers to stay on the field, and I have now evidence that they're out of every 50 soldiers I get, 2 of them are going to run, I'm probably going to try to figure out who's going to run first so that doesn't happen and the other 48 don't follow, because running is also a trauma response. So that's the first thing that came up. And the second thing that came up is I am sitting here wondering, and this is something that when I would love to see happen in the medical community. I don't know if it's ever going to happen in our healthcare in the system that we have now. But to do a trauma survey. Trauma surveys are basically where you establish safety with somebody, and then you go through and kind of figure out, like, are there experiences that you've had in your life that like lend you to having trauma responses? And so, this could be really helpful if you have a patient who, doesn't want to, like, needs you to knock on the door first instead of just opening it, or needs you to say their name loudly before you touch them, right? I had plenty of experiences in the healthcare setting where you would go in and like interact with somebody in a way you thought was normal, and they would have a threat response. And so I think it would be so interesting if we could go back and do trauma surveys on those soldiers to see there's probably something that happened or something ancestral or generational or personal that happened that led them to have their primary threat response be to flee.
Oh yeah. And especially too, what's interesting, when you didn't have that level of understanding, when people at that time and place didn't understand it to that level, that there are all these things, the idea was, okay, we still recognize that this is some sort of a problem.
Yeah.
You have like the Spartans, their training methods were incredibly brutal. Anybody who may have, because you didn't go to fight as a full Spartan for like decades, you waited. You would be in skirmishes, you'd be put under the most immense stress. And the idea was, well, if you did break, if you couldn't hack it, if you had some sort of, again, I'm saying that, but like, if you couldn't do that, you'd be weeded out.
Yeah.
Which is why, they were considered so powerful, because in the heat of battle, they would never retreat. They would never surrender. They would literally, in a lot of cases, starve to death or die rather than retreat. And those retreated as like, oh, it's this incredible, like these incredible people. Even as later on, though, it's like, okay, or we go the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And okay, if anybody does retreat, everybody goes and serves. We have mass conscription stuff from World War I. Anybody does retreat, you start running back the other way. It's the officer's job to pull out his pistol and shoot that person in front of her and go, hey, this is what happens.
Yeah.
We understand that this is tough, but we can't have this sort of thing. And this will break down unit morale, unit cohesion. World War I, the idea was, well, if we have the best morale, if we have the best spirit, the fighting spirit, that's why so many people were just constantly thrown into the meat grinder, because the idea was, well, if we break their spirit, if we break their will, and they don't want to fight no more, when we go back up over that line and we really push into them, they're going to turn and run.
This is so fascinating just to think about too, because I think there's some really interesting deconstructive, like massive shifts happening in the US military today, and looking at like the numbers have really shifted of who used to voluntarily sign up versus who's voluntarily staying in now. People who are going into the military are staying in the military for less time. They're leaving quickly. But we're also seeing this in healthcare. We're seeing this in academia, in teachers and education. We're seeing this in people who are going into fields where I think we're using that same sort of, we're building on the historical understanding that we have of, look, in order to get these, like, prevent these bad things from happening and to get people to do what we need them to do in order to win, we need to actually kind of cause some harm and cause some trauma to get them to conform in order to then be able to protect the whole.
Oh yeah.
And it's just such a fascinating way of thinking about approaching helping people. Like I'm thinking of David Goggins. There's a part of me that absolutely loves everything he does, and there's another part that's like, I don't understand him at all. But he's got this book, Can't Hurt Me, but he's voluntarily gone through Hell Week and like done these things in order to be able to push himself to that point. And part of that was because it was like, you know what, if I can harm myself to the point that, like, and I can still handle it, no one else can harm me. And so I think that there's that mentality that comes into it. But, you know, in this 1860s, 1880s, 1900s, this is where I think things start to really get interesting, because this is where we start looking at not just, we start looking at psychological trauma and physical trauma, but we start looking at it through a different lens.
Oh yeah. Really, what they kind of figured out too around this time was, the Prussians, I think, were the first ones to really do it. They would line up 100 soldiers in a line, and they would hang up a target, essentially like a white sheet or, a bullseye target, at a set distance, say 50 yards. And then they would say, okay, everybody fires a shot, tries to hit the bullseye. And what they would find is it was like 70 to 80% of soldiers, first shot, boom, they would hit that bullseye. That was essentially, it wasn't a human silhouette, but it was essentially person size. So they were like, okay, so in battle, this will be what happened. And then when they really started looking at the actual data and stuff from U.S. Civil War, the Russo-Japanese War, even up to World War One, okay, well, you'd see somebody at that distance, soldier with his gun, soldier didn't kill him. The actual amount of shots on target that would then kill the person were way below what should have been expected. And you start seeing the military minds going, wait a second, what is the deal? What is going on? Why are they not killing them? And in a lot of cases, what they would find is a lot of soldiers, even in all the intensity of battle, the smoke, the noise, everything like that, when they were shooting, a lot of times they were shooting above their enemies' heads. The idea was a gun is very loud. It's mean. It was almost a big way of amplifying your voice and saying, stay away. Get away from me. I don't want you to be here. Run away. Run away. Instead
I'm not
of
laughing because it's like, okay, but I'm just laughing going, I never thought about that.
Yeah, and legitimately, it wasn't even in some cases in their brain where they were doing, but the main idea was they would even have, like in World War One, two patrols would end up coming up right next to each other. They would both have guns. And what they start doing, they'd start shouting at each other. You better get out of here. They'd start insulting. Some
they
cases,
didn't want to kill each other.
They would throw rocks at each other.
They didn't want to kill each other.
And then after they'd be walking away, they'd go, oh, yeah, we got guns out of it. We could have killed them in 2 minutes. And really, you saw a lot more of that. Like, I just want them to leave me alone. I don't hate that other person. Yeah. Now, you started seeing them trying to get them to hate the other person.
Yeah.
The dehumanization of, like, it's not just, another soldier from another country who's the same as you. No, they are evil. They're
dirty.
They're dirty, especially
immoral.
Using disgust.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Yes. They're vermin. They're rats.
They're not human.
They're not human.
Subhuman.
Yes. That is one of the biggest things, the dehumanization, because what they found is if you could get soldiers to not see that person on the other side that they're aiming at as a person, you saw them as either evil incarnate or as in some ways a disease that needs to be rid of the world needs to be rid of it, the amount of chances that that person aims and fires and then actually kills that enemy increase dramatically.
Well, and you know, maybe it makes sense to carry this soldier piece all the way through to today, and then go back and talk about the non-militarized piece, because I'm thinking about one of the things that we talked about in that TikTok was the profound difference between World War I and World War II, and then when you started to get into Vietnam, and the traumatic experiences and how trauma shifted in both soldiers and in society at large between those types of wars. And so World War I, right, was more, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but World War I was more, and World War II, we're going over on ships. We're staying traditionally in the same units. We've trained together. We've been taught, you know, a lot of us voluntarily signed up. Some of us were drafted. A lot of us voluntarily signed up. It's seen as a good thing for us to go over and to fight this war. We're going to come home as heroes if we win. And, you know, a lot of horror, like horrific things happening and being seen. And when they're coming back, they've got these 2 to 3 weeks where they're with whoever's left in their unit. They're on the ship. They're able to decompress. They're able to have the time to like kind of make meaning, tell stories, like write stuff down, process through some things, bring their nervous systems down, come home, lauded as heroes. Now, there's a lot of stuff that happened after that, after they came home. But comparing that to Vietnam, you know, Vietnam, we're drafting people, they're people who don't want to fight this war. The country itself, our country itself, isn't seeing this war as something that we should be necessarily entering into. We get over there, it's really hard to identify the enemy. It's hard to stay together as units. There's just chaos a lot of the time. Plus, now we have video.
Yeah.
We have
plus, in your training alone too, couple that with the fact that all the major military, especially the U.S. military and stuff, instead of just training with, okay, you're firing at a random target, that target became human shaped. That target started looking like the enemy.
So you were actually practicing killing people.
You were practicing killing people.
Not hitting a target.
Exactly. It wasn't just, are you getting physically fit? Are you doing, it's, you're going under something. You're having fire shooting. In some cases, they would shoot like a machine gun above the soldiers. You're aiming at something that looks like a person, that you have practice dummies. In some ways, they started off very rudimentary, but eventually they started looking real. Yeah. They started wearing like a helmet. Well, they started looking closer. And when you, especially once you start getting to Vietnam, you start training that automatic instinct. Yeah. You start seeing person, shoot.
Okay. So there's no response time. You're turning off your humanity while you're also dehumanizing the person.
And you're seeing more of you actually killing people. And you're not having that time to decompress as well.
Yeah, because when they're coming back,
right,
they're coming back. They're coming back. They're coming back alone. They're coming back on planes, and they're coming back to a country that's not grateful or understanding of anything that they just went through, and they're expected to immediately integrate back in.
Yeah, because those people also, in some ways, they tried to say, "Hey, these people are evil vermin, what have you," but it really didn't work as well when you didn't have society also doing that. Right. You know, it wasn't, you know, in World War II, in some ways, it made it easier because, you know, the Nazis, I mean, they were the Nazis. Like, it is not that hard for people to have gone, wow, those are evil people that I'm having to kill. They're doing these terrible things. They're hurting all these people. I'm saving lives. I'm saving innocent civilians by going through and ending the Nazi threat, as well as not only you're getting better at killing people, but those people, it made it a lot harder when you didn't have that support at home, when you didn't have all those other systems, to feel like that person that you know you killed, that was an actual person. Yeah. But that person they weren't hating you. They were not trying to invade your homeland. In some cases, was that a civilian? Was that an NVA soldier? Was that Viet Cong? Who is who, especially when you started really you go into a village, well, who is the enemy here? Well, you don't even necessarily know. And then you're coming back. You don't see those as this evil, horrible force. You were there not because you were trying to stop Hitler, but because you were in some more
nebulous.
Yeah, exactly. It was the stopping of communism. it was the stopping of, it was this two leaders fighting a war against each other for some reason, especially in like Korea too. With Korea, where it's like, okay, why exactly again? We're like, okay, we're trying to stop communism. Okay, but like, why in particular?
Yeah.
Where's it? You start seeing the more and more you have that, the more you can empathize with that enemy in the other foxhole.
Yeah.
The harder and harder it's going to be to kill them. But when you are really good at automatically, you have that fast twitch.
And I'm imagining just the cognitive dissonance around that of like, I don't necessarily even believe in the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing, but I've been so trained to do it that now every time I do it, I'm doing it and then I'm questioning afterwards. And I also think if we go back a little bit too, because the the American Civil War is one that I think is really fascinating for people. Because a lot of people are like, well, it's in the same country and there's, like there had to be a lot of trauma around that. And absolutely there was. And the interesting thing about that is that most people who were fighting in that war too, from a cause perspective, were like, well, I live in the South, so I'm fighting against the North. I live in the North, so I'm fighting against the South. There were some people who had and please correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, yeah.
There were some people who had super strong opinions about why that war was happening. And then there were other people who were like, well, I live in Kentucky, so I'm fighting over here. I live in New York, so I'm fighting on this side.
You had draft riots. A lot of people don't really recognize. You had like the New York draft riots. You had even the president, Abraham Lincoln, had to suspend habeas corpus.
Yeah.
Because he basically would jail dissenters, because it wasn't like everybody was super. When people were like, how does this affect me? What's going on? More so. Yeah. You had open riots. You had parts of New York City burned down.
Yeah.
Tons of people killed because they were like, no, we're burning our records. We are not getting drafted to go fight in this battle that we're not. This isn't us. I'm in New York.
And I think that this is interesting for anyone, and particularly as somebody who's both Black and white. I just find this so fascinating. And I think that it's important because when we learn about the Civil War in school, at least for me, when I learned about the Civil War in, middle school, high school, it was, well, the North fought the South, the North won. Then the people in the North wanted to fight the South, people in the South wanted to fight the North won, and the story, right? And there's not any of this explanation of a lot of what was going on underneath of it and why. And then you fast forward 160 years since that's happening, and you're starting to see a lot of, and I think that this is an important piece of the history perspective too, is we rewrite things, or we completely negate what's happened. We don't, and this is what I hope people are picking up on, and it's why I keep coming back to today and then jumping back to back then and today. Anyone see the repetition? Like, we've been writing about this. We're like, this is happening over and over and over and over and over again. And we've only talked about the military side of this. We haven't even talked about, and I think that we should go here before this episode's 5 hours long, but the piece around in the 1860s, 1880s, this is where there's some really interesting research happening in Vienna and happening in Britain and France, and it's happening due to this phenomenon that they're starting to see called railway spine, right?
Yeah, it was really kind of one of those first times you really start seeing trauma, not just from a completely physical, like because somebody got a limb, blown up due to either war, due to some sort of a industrial accident or farming accident. You really started seeing like railway prominence, wildly increasing, railways being built across, the quote unquote, the civilized world, but places where they had enough money to basically build railways. You started seeing more railways, which means more people traveling on rail cars, which especially in the early days is a huge increase in railway crashes, trains hitting, and at that amount of weight, at that kind of speed and with the lack of regulation, they weren't just, bumping into each other. There
Yeah.
wasn't just, it was catastrophic. Two trains on the same track going in going in head to head.
Yeah.
And you started seeing, I think starting in, let's see where we got, 1886, you had them first starting in Vienna to talk about railway spine, which initially they first started thinking, well, it might actually be due to some sort of maybe almost a microscopic, spinal lesions or something like that. Because when these trains hit together, okay, we're going to pay out to people who, lost a leg in it or whatever. But there were some people in cars, like 20 cars back, that are all of a sudden having serious symptoms of the crash that wasn't directly like hit by a piece of like steel by the actual train car crumpling.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't buried like in the actual guts of the train. And you had people, especially lawyers, politicians, stuff at the time, who didn't maybe want to pay out, in a lot of ways to some of these people, saying, well, it was neurotic litigation. All these people are just, they're making stuff up. They're just trying to get money. And you first started seeing people like recognize, no, these people aren't faking it, quote, faking it.
Mm-hmm.
This is not just people trying to get money. Like, there is something really wrong with these people. And they started really looking into like, okay, was it maybe the force of like the stopping? You're moving at a speed, all of a sudden you're stopped, you're thrown back against your chair. Maybe that caused something either within your brain, within your spine. They called it railway brain or railway spine.
Mm-hmm.
They started recognizing like something is happening. There was maybe, is it bubbles? Is it, and the one that I saw was the most prevalent one was, okay, it might be like little micro like tumor lesions on the spine, because at this point they've recognized, okay, your spine, if certain things happen to it, okay, it can affect your leg, it can affect your arm. Okay, it must be something within your spine or your brain that's physically happening, because we can see it's causing something.
So I didn't know about this before we were planning out the episode. And when you started talking about this, I got really like nerdily excited, because I was like, oh my gosh, this is the like predecessor research and conundrum to whiplash with cars.
Mm-hmm.
There is a researcher, his name's Robert Scare, which I think it's interesting that his last name's Scare, but I think it's Scaer. It's not like Richard Scarry. Also, if anyone read those books when they were younger, it's like the little animals driving around in the Apple cars. But yeah, no, and Robert Scare is actually, that's what it is, not Richard. So Robert Scare, Dr. Robert Scare talks about, he did a lot of research in the late, I want to say like 80s, 90s around whiplash. And interestingly, when you are immobilized, meaning you're sitting in a seat and an impact occurs that is outside of, even if like you caused the accident, but particularly if you are just riding along and you are not in control of a vehicle, and that vehicle comes into contact with another and it causes like significant change in force, even if there is no physical sign of damage, what they're actually starting to see is that immobilization while the threat is occurring is what leads to this issue in the neurological system, in our nervous systems, around the processing of what's happened. And so the reason I want to bring this up is because throughout history, we've seen a lot of examples of when people are in a quote unquote helpless scenario. So I'm thinking back to the very first story you shared of this guy who's like, there's this person who could easily kill me right now, and I'm frozen in terror. He could have killed me, but instead he turned to my comrade and killed him instead. And I went blind. That immobilization we have now found from a scientific perspective really positively predicts if somebody is going to have post-traumatic symptoms after going through an accident. And so whiplash, a lot of times we've heard about this of people, getting in litigation and being called, fakes or phonies or frauds. Here's another really fascinating thing. And Dr. Scare actually wrote a book called The Body Bears the Burden. It is very research and science heavy. It is not a book for someone who just like wants to do like casual reading. I think it took me 3 months to get through it, and it could use another read. But what they found is that people who are in accidents like that afterwards have like a statistically significant higher likelihood of getting into another car accident like that. And what they found is the research shows a lot of times it's on the anniversaries of previous accidents. And so they really started looking at that from a psychological perspective and going, what is happening with inside the brain and the body that this person is getting stuck in this trauma, in which when the trauma occurred, they were literally stuck. One of the other things that we see psychologically is that if you have somebody who's held down, so I'll have people say, yeah, it's so weird. I have claustrophobia and I have no idea why. And I'll say, well, did you experience any medical procedures as a child where you were immobilized or held down? And they're like, oh, there was this one time when I was 4 and they put me in this papoose and they held me down and I was screaming bloody murder and they did this and they did that. And I'm like, well, guess what? Our nervous systems do this really interesting thing where if we get put into an immobilized situation and we either go into the response where we feel helpless and we don't fight, or we try to fight and it is completely futile, that leads to effects of trauma. And so I love that I don't love, but I think it's awesome that we can look back to the 1880s and someone's going, hey, wait a second. Like, I don't see any physical signs that something has happened. And yet these people are having significant symptoms. Again, we tie that to today's diagnosis of conversion disorder, or I forget they just came out with a new name for it, which it's still not a great name. It implies that the person is making it up. And it's not something that's made up. It's something that we don't yet fully understand.
Yeah. Humans, I feel like, are pretty bad at being able to be okay with recognizing that there's something we don't know yet.
Yeah. Well, we don't understand it, so it's not real. Yeah. Right. No, that's
not understandable.
Yeah. Or it's not understandable. Yeah. But I think that this was cool research because it was also happening right at the point where you're going to get to me talking about the soapbox I love to climb on more than anything around Charcot and Freud. Mm-hmm. This is in that 1880s, 1890s range where we're starting to talk about hysteria. And do you want to talk on hysteria? Or you want me to talk on hysteria? No. I'm like, I will talk on hysteria. Yeah. I'm like, you're the history guys. So I'm like, so what I thought was really fascinating about, I'm going to try to do this in like 3 minutes. Here's what happened was, right? So Charcot starts this like really cool, basically an institute. He's like, I want to study what is happening in these women and children and these people who are kind of like the outcasts and the marginalized people of society. So he worked with a lot of like women who were in sex work. He worked with a lot of people who had issues with like getting thrown out of their homes. He worked with a lot of people where he actually offered them a place to live and stay and like have safety. And Charcot, while he may have done it from the goodness of his heart, also did it because he's like, I want to understand this. Like, I think what a lot of people don't understand about Charcot was he was like, I am coming at this from the perspective of a researcher first and maybe a good guy second, like a distant second. So all of the kind things that he did were really from the perspective of, I want to study this. And so as he's studying this, they're seeing, oh, wow, this is really fascinating. A lot of these women and children are exhibiting these signs that we're going to we're going to name hysteria. And hysteria, if you go back and look at the symptoms of hysteria and you line them up with our now diagnosis of PTSD, like they overlap quite nicely. So
it's not really caused by a floating uterus.
No, it's not caused by a floating uterus. And by the way, that's when you talk about hysteria and we talk about hysterectomies, that's what it's tied to, is like they have a problem with their uterus. No, that's not actually what's going on. They don't need to be stimulated to the point of relaxation. I'll let y'all go do that Googling, go look up how they used to treat hysteria with various objects. But so around this time, Freud is coming up, and Freud actually starts doing some really, really incredibly profound research. And there's a paper, I want to say, it's called The Etiology of Hysteria. And I can't remember the year. I want to say it's in like the 1880s, 1890s that he publishes this. And he brings this paper to all of these experts, you know, in the Charcot Page era. And basically this paper says, hey, so hysteria is due to, I think, the fact that all of these people have experienced either sexual, physical, or emotional abuse and neglect in their younger years. And oh, by the way, the bourgeoisie men, the upper class, upper middle class men, we're the ones that are doing it. And you can imagine in the 1890s that went over pretty poorly. So I'm paraphrasing, like I said, I'm doing this really quickly. Basically, they said, hey, Freud, you want to run with that, then you're going to get kicked out of all these places. Plus, he's friends with some of these men. He's operating in space, and some of these men are responsible for funding. The other piece that people neglect to talk about with Freud is that there was potentially some serious substance use disorder around cocaine and some other substances with him. And so again, my question is, what the heck happened to Freud to put him into this research in the beginning? When I see somebody who has a really significant substance use disorder in my world, I say, what happened to them? When I see somebody who's being friends with people who are doing abuse and harm like this, my question is, what got them here? And the outcome of all of this is that Freud basically like denounces all of that research and says, never mind, hysteria is due to dysfunctional sexual fantasies. This is where Freud really goes into his psychoanalytic theory, which is relatively helpful for people. It's the basis or one of the founding pieces of modern cognitive behavioral therapy that we use still today. And he really abandons this idea that, hey, like these people are being hurt emotionally, psychologically, sexually, physically, and that's why, or they're being neglected, and that's why we're seeing these symptoms. Like this is trauma. And so
let's ignore the cause.
Right. So if you think about after that, it's not until the 1960s, again, with Korea and Vietnam, that we start seeing people really looking at, hey, we should probably study this.
Yeah.
And then it's not until the 1970s, 1980s, where we go, hey, hold on a second. We should probably be looking at like domestic violence. We should probably be looking at sexual assault and sexual violence towards women. We should probably be looking at the profound impact that child abuse has on people's development, because maybe being hurt in these ways causes problems.
Right.
And I'm being a little flippant here because, again, there's a part of me that's like, how did we wait until the 1970s?
How until 1945 was there not a domestic violence law in the United States?
It was
nothing legally speaking.
Yeah,
the first one, I think it was 45 or 46.
Yeah, a wife did not have to consent to having sexual relationships with, or a sexual relationship with her husband for him to have sex. Right. You look at the other piece is, and you have some of this here, is, you know, the early 1900s is also where we see the American Medical Association be formed. This is where we see the beginnings of the American Psychological Association. What a lot of people don't know too is that there's some wild history in there with the APA and the AMA around eugenics and racism and like determining what is a psychological disorder and what isn't. The first or the third version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, that's the Bible of the APA, the American Psychological Association. That I think it's the third edition, had homosexuality still as a psychological disorder.
Also the first one, though, that even introduced PTSD as the diagnosis.
1980. Actually, I think DSM-3 was where they removed homosexual. I can't remember which one. It was the third or the fourth that they removed homosexuality. But y'all, like, 1980 at, at, at the earliest was where we took homosexuality out of the DSM, and where we put PTSD in. And the interesting thing is that in the DSM-3 around PTSD, they classified PTSD as an anxiety disorder. And the other thing that they did was they said that there had to be the identification of a specific stressor. So if the patient came to you and could not tell you why they were experiencing the symptoms they were experiencing, you could not diagnose them with PTSD.
Catastrophic.
It had to be catastrophic. So if you came to them and you were like, hey, I don't know, I keep having these flashbacks and I keep having these nightmares and these memories, and I think something bad happened to me when I was younger, but I don't know. They'd be like, yeah, that's not PTSD.
Yeah. My dog was killed in front of me in a brutal way.
Oh, well, it's just a dog. Dogs die.
Right. And there's one more piece of history that I think is really important. There's a study called the Adverse Childhood Event Study, the ACE study. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris talks about this. She's got a famous TED Talk, and I want to say it's from the late 2000s, early 2000s. I think it's the late 2000s. They did a study, and the cool part about this study that I think is so important from a historical perspective is that when they did it with a primarily white middle class large cohort of patients, which is a big deal. And the reason that that's a big deal is, well, because normally when we think about trauma, a lot of times we're looking at the most marginalized populations. We're looking at women, we're looking at children, we're looking at people of color, we're looking at low socioeconomic status. We're like, well, of course they're going to experience more trauma but like middle class white people don't have trauma. And when they did this study, they looked at, okay, we're going to ask people about these serious and significant events that we know are usually negative, right? So a parent being incarcerated, the death of a close, like intimate family member, seeing domestic violence in the home or experiencing violence from a parent with a significant mental health issue or substance use, what was the other one? Lack of access. I want to say it was to like safe housing or something, but there were 10, and they were pretty like hardcore.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found is that people who had a score of 0, meaning that they hadn't experienced any of those events, versus people who had a score of 4 or 5 or above, it was like a 7 times higher rate of alcoholism or substance use, an exponentially higher rate of using cigarettes, an exponentially higher rate of domestic violence, an exponentially higher rate of experiencing sexual assault as an adult, an exponentially higher rate of developing cancer, heart disease, diabetes, like all of these things that were both physical and social. And they were like, wait a second, are the people who are using substances doing so because they're bad people and then they're getting hurt? Or the people who have been exposed to these types of trauma, are they getting predisposed to then using substances, getting into relationships that aren't healthy, not getting access to being able to make choices that are good choices for them because of what's happened to them? And that's why I said doing this in white middle class was so important, because if this is happening in white middle class.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that unfortunately does tend to be a pretty decent predictor. But the more you have like the Milgram experiment, they were like, wait, why were they so susceptible to the Nazis? They must be bad people. They must have some sort of an inherent part of being German that caused that. And then when they did some of those experiments with Americans to see, like, okay, you put somebody in a white coat and you have them tell you to do something. That was not generally something you'd be okay doing, but you had an authority figure tell you. And all of a sudden they went, uh-oh, something's wrong here, because all of a sudden these Americans who would never follow along with such a regime, all of a sudden they started and you'd really kind of have to look into it. But they really started doing some of these behaviors in the same ways,
Yeah.
to the same levels the Germans did. And they went, wait, well, maybe it's not something about being German.
Right.
Maybe it is something that's more of like a human thing. But if you really look at why they were doing it, what their main aim was, okay, well, let's show either how virtuous, Americans are in comparison, or like, let's try and figure out what was wrong with those people. And then they start realizing, oh, wait, maybe it's not just those people. Maybe it is upper class Americans.
Yeah.
Maybe it is Americans at large. And the experiment was bad for some reason, especially with not debriefing the people then afterwards. But it's
that study was one of the ones that led to us developing a lot more stringent study methods and making sure that you got approval before you
about a trauma and heart that study did. But it is just fascinating when you really, because as you were saying, that's what kind of reminded me. It's like, yeah, the reason for doing that though wasn't just to like, well, let's see what people do with somebody in authority. It was like, well, let's see those Germans that look a lot like us. In fact, a lot of our country is descended from Germany, and especially in certain areas and stuff. What's wrong with them over there that isn't wrong with us?
Yeah.
Like, obviously, we're not, they're this other. And then they sort of realize, oh, wait, hold on. Maybe we're more the same than we are different.
Well, and that's a terrifying concept, right? That's an absolutely terrifying concept. And I think that this is what, if you go back and like I said, this is a very brief overview of us pulling out some points.
Yeah, I feel like we could keep going
but like, if you look at all of this, there's patterns. And I think one of the things you can pull out of this is, wow, okay, if we create a scenario in which it is, we threaten a human's psychological or physical safety, and we tell them that they can get out of that scenario by hurting someone else a lot, maybe not the first time, maybe not the third time, maybe not the fifth time, but humans are like this is part of our humanity, is that we, for the vast majority of us, there are some people who, outliers from a character perspective, the vast majority of humans, like almost nearly all humans, we don't want to kill each other and we don't want to hurt each other. The only reason that we will kill or hurt another person is to protect ourselves or to survive, from a resource perspective. And so when you look at a lot of the conflict, a lot of the places that trauma has been caused the most, and when you look at people who, like Freud, when I was on that TikTok, one of the most fascinating comments I kept getting was like, well, wait a second, now I feel bad for Freud. I'm like, they're like, hold on, I'm having kind of an existential crisis because I've always seen Freud as kind of a jerk. And now I'm feeling for him, because can you imagine how often does this happen in history that someone says, hey, y'all, wait a second, maybe what we're doing here isn't the most healthy, or like it might be a little traumatic. Maybe there's something we can clean up. Can you imagine having your entire livelihood threatened over that? Can you, and I think we see that in today's society. I see there are a lot of people, I'm a business owner, I teach other people how to grow a business. There are a lot of people out there who, due to past painful experiences around trying to share how they feel or trying to contribute to the historical perspective, have been told, like, you will be threatened if you continue to do that. You will be canceled if you continue to do that. And I think there's so much in history that we can look at and we can learn from and go, y'all, like, do we really want to do this again?
Well, yeah. And threats to people's health and well-being, it's kind of funny because nowadays I feel like when you look at people who were tortured into confession during the witch trials is a great example. People are always like, well, they were just bad. I would never have given up random names or anything like that. And it's like, you have no idea what you would have done. Yeah. Not only under that extreme pain, thinking you are going to die, thinking at the very least, you're going to lose everything you have, which could result in you starving to death. Yeah. There were some people who didn't. And those people are generally more the outliers, because when people are threatened with their life and safety, people are willing to do a lot of things like that. People are willing to like name, just give me a name and it'll stop. Okay, Bill.
Well, And I think to the other side of that, you know, we also normalized. Like, I think that one of the things that has been so fascinating for me is to, now that I understand trauma more, look back and go, wow, a lot of the things that I went through, a lot of the things that we do as a society or as a, you know, in a particular community, whether that's healthcare, academia, or like whatever, it's really harmful. It's really traumatic. We threaten people's needs in order to get them to conform, for the quote unquote safety
Right.
of the group.
Because like it or not, it does generally work.
It does.
It's
It
not
works really
an
well.
okay thing to do
Right.
to people. It is harmful, but it is one of those situations where humans, I think, at a subconscious inherent level, like historically speaking, really throughout human history, have realized there's certain things maybe they don't recognize how bad necessarily they've been.
Yeah.
But they definitely will recognize if something works.
Well, and I want to take that even further, because I think sometimes we will look back and we'll judge negatively, and then other times we'll look back and we'll judge positively, and we'll say, well, you know, they didn't know any better, or we'll say, well, that's just how things were at the time. And it can be a both and, right? Like, we can go back, we can look back and say, wow, that was really messed up. And also, the person who did that at the time didn't know it was as messed up as it was, or it had been so normalized. I think that
or the objective was so good and right.
Right.
Like, yes, okay, what I'm doing, this probably isn't right, but
the reason I'm doing
that is to save the lives of people either I care about, or to save more lives. You know, okay, maybe it's bad, but it's for a good purpose. It's for a good cause.
Well, and we're going to talk so much more about this in the episode on propaganda and shame, which I'm really like. I think propaganda is one of your favorite topics, and shame's one of my favorite topics. And interestingly enough, we're going to talk a lot about Freud's double nephew in the the propaganda episode, which still we had to go look up, like, what's a double nephew? So that's coming in a few weeks. But the other piece I wanted to bring in was around that ACE score that we were talking about recently. So when I originally took the ACE survey, you can take it online, I scored a 1, which was fascinating, because I was like, oh, I only have an ACE score of 1. Like, if you look at the amount of physical, psychological, mental, emotional effects I've had due to trauma, like, they don't really track with an ACE score of 1. And one of the things that happened in the last 15 years is they went, wait, y'all, we're still doing this. We're still saying that some of these things that can be profoundly subjectively traumatic don't count. And so they actually added in several things. They added in not just being abused by an adult, they added in being sexually assaulted by somebody who has assumed authority over you regardless of their age. I think they started with 6 years or older, and then they went, nope, assumed authority regardless of their age. They looked at school bullying. They looked at a lot of other examples, and I was like, oh shoot, my score just went up to a 5 or a 6. And a lot of people had that experience. And so this brings me to, like, historically, if we look back through the ages, and if you asked people how many people have trauma, one of the questions, or one of the, I guess, arguments I hear a lot running the Institute is like, well, everybody has trauma. So, like, is it that important to look at? And I don't know about y'all, but if we look back historically, yeah, because what we're learning, what we have seen over time is that this narrow definition of trauma is causing trauma to be perpetuated, because we're saying, hey, no, like, that's not trauma, or that's not a problem, or that can't lead to this. You didn't have it as bad as this person. You didn't go off to war. And I think that that's such an important piece to bring in, because that is the first thing that you said to me when I came home, and I was like, I've just gone through this training and had my mind officially blown. And I think I want to study this, and I think I want to do this. And I remember you saying, like, but isn't trauma like a soldier?
100%. Either that, or you were involved in some sort of industrial accident and got, you know, half your body like crushed in a mill or something. That was my thought of trauma, was you saw or had something happen to you that was in such a beyond the pale of normality, if you will.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, yeah. And I was like, you have all your limbs,
Yeah.
you know?
And so if you look at the history of trauma, one of the biggest things that I would love to pull out of this and invite you to look at is the answer I give to people when they're like, well, everyone has trauma, so no one has trauma. And I'm like, well, I'm going to say this as a average or a rounding up. Everyone has a nose, so no one has a nose. Like that doesn't work. Everyone has trauma, so no one has trauma, or so like trauma's normal and we don't need to do anything about it. That is, I think, one of the most historically invalidating things that we can say.
Yeah, it's really hard to look forward and look at how a certain time period is going to be judged when you're still at least somewhat in it. But yeah, I definitely think that that's one of these things that when we get a little bit more distance on that, people are going to go, wait, really?
Like really, we didn't look at people's psychological health and mental health as like holistically tied and intertwined to their physical health. We didn't recognize that people could go through something psychological and it could affect them physically. We didn't recognize that people could go through something physically and it could affect them psychologically. Like, what were we doing?
Why were we grouping it on such large groups of people when this, of course, this is more of an individual.
Yeah.
Like this is on a closer scale, but like, how did people not recognize that this person was obviously suffering things just because they didn't, go through the Battle of the Somme? Well, like, or, and it's like, you start really kind of seeing that. Hopefully, I feel like at least somewhat more where people start going, okay, maybe more of an understanding of like, it really does matter to each person.
It really does. And this individualized approach, and not the individualized approach of like, I'm special and my trauma is like more specialer than someone else's.
I think some people misunderstand it to that in a lot of ways.
We have this saying, there's no trauma Olympics. Like you're like, if you want to fight for the gold medal of trauma, good on you. I love that journey for you. Like we're not doing that. Everybody's trauma is different and everybody's trauma affects them differently. And that individualized approach is one of the most trauma-informed things that we can do. Instead of going, hey, well, everyone has trauma, so, this is how we approach that. It's, no, we've got this way of this lens of looking at, okay, everyone has trauma, and this person in particular, how do we understand what has happened to them and how it has impacted them and why they are doing what they're doing now, and how do we help them release that constriction and that restriction and that disconnection that's happening, and like that's the work that we're doing.
And it's not easy, because it really does in a lot of ways go against easy, quote unquote, easy science, where you have, math, 2 and 2 equaling 4. Yeah, that's really straightforward and easy to see, but it's not one of those. It's like, I'm not trying to blame people as like, how have you not seen this? It's like, it's not an easy thing for people to get. I mean, it took me quite a while to really recognize like, oh, this is kind of what you're talking about here, because in a lot of ways, that was where my mindset was. So it's also like, not trying to shame people who are not
at
understanding, because this is by no means an easy thing to wrap your brain around,
Yeah. So, if you've hung with us to this end, like, thank you so much. And we invite you into Trauma Club, where we talk a lot more about these things. We meet on a weekly basis, and we talk about this individualized approach. Or if you're like, oh, actually, I'm thinking about this from a business owner perspective, we also have our Trauma Sensitive Business Foundations course, where you can come in and like really be supported around understanding how all of this affects your business, because it really, really does. And as a business owner, I think I see trauma more pop up unexpectedly in business more than I do anywhere else, because I think people don't expect it to pop up there. And so, we just, if you have any questions about anything that we've talked about today, there's a button in the show notes. You can send us a note and tell us like, hey, like, I really enjoyed this part, or ask a question. And also you can email us at hello@institutefortrauma.com. and let us know what you think, or if there's anything else you'd like us to cover, or if we can help in any other way.
Yeah, I'm more than excited to do so.
Yeah. So until next episode, be well, and we'll talk to you then. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of our podcast. If you've enjoyed what you just heard and you'd like to dive deeper into trauma and recovery work, come check out Trauma Club, our private membership community. It costs less than a therapy session, feels a lot better than a night out distracting yourself, and is built to be enjoyable for extroverts and introverts alike. You can head to jointraumaclub.com to hop in today and use the code BTIFAN, that's BTI fan, to save 50% off your first month. And if you want to talk to TLC or me directly, we would be stoked to hear from you. You can send us a quick message by heading to the show notes and clicking the Send Us a Text Message button. See you next time.